The Dwemer were one of Tamriel's great subterranean powers, a highly advanced people whose ruins still dot the map long after their civilization vanished. Their disappearance is the mystery. They did not fade away gradually, and there is no clear record of collapse. Instead, the entire race seems to have been removed in a single event tied to their own ambition. The question is whether the Dwemer were destroyed, transformed, or erased from existence. That uncertainty is what keeps the subject alive. Most Elder Scrolls cultures leave behind some version of their story, but the Dwemer are known mostly through broken machines, buried cities, and conflicting later accounts. Some sources point to divine punishment, others connect their fate to the Heart of Lorkhan and a failed experiment. The answer may draw from both, and it starts with what the Dwemer were trying to do when they vanished. To understand why the Dwemer disappearance still feels so abrupt, it helps to start with who they were before the mystery ever began. They were not a minor tribe on the edge of Tamriel. In the Merethic and First eras, the Dwemer were one of the most advanced and self-contained civilizations in the region, known for industry, scholarship, and an unusually strict faith in reason and technique. They are often called dwarves, but that name is mostly an outsider's label and has nothing to do with height. What defined them was culture. Where many Tamrielic societies grounded authority in religion, ancestry, or conquest, the Dwemer trusted engineering, experimentation, and analysis. Their ruins still show that mindset clearly. They built underground cities, sealed workshops, vaults, and machines that continued operating long after their creators were gone. That underground pattern was not just a matter of style. It reflected how they lived and how they thought about permanence. Dwemer settlements were usually carved deep into stone and expanded into vast networks of halls, storage rooms, and machine chambers. These were not simple shelters. They were controlled environments built for durability. Their metalwork, tonal devices, and steam-driven constructs appear across their sites, and even in ruin they suggest a civilization that valued precision over ornament. Other cultures built to honor the gods. The Dwemer built to solve problems. They also kept themselves apart from most of Tamriel. Compared with neighboring peoples, they were famously isolated, and that isolation was deliberate. They had little interest in being shaped by outside customs, and they often treated other traditions with open contempt. That made them difficult neighbors and poor allies, but it also helped preserve their identity over long periods of time. Their cities became centers of their own power rather than parts of a wider regional order. The most important conflict in their history was with the Kaimer, the people who would later become the Dunmer. That rivalry was not only about land, it was also about belief. The Kaimer followed religious and cultural traditions the Dwemer rejected, and the Dwemer returned that faith with scorn. In the First era, that divide sharpened into repeated struggle, especially in and around Resdain, where both peoples competed for territory, influence, and survival. This is what makes the Dwemer more than just a lost civilization. They were brilliant, organized, and confident in their ability to understand the world through knowledge and control. They could build cities beneath mountains, produce complex machinery on a large scale, and maintain a separate identity for generations. But that same confidence also made them dangerous to themselves. They seem to have believed that reality could be mastered if they simply pushed hard enough. Their ruins still reflect that contradiction. The halls are immense, but empty. The mechanisms are intricate, but often still running with no clear purpose. Everything suggests a people who expected continuity, not disappearance. Nothing about the surviving evidence looks like a culture already fading away. If anything, it points to a society that was still organized, still formidable, and still committed to its own path right up to the end. Their influence also stretches across Tamriel. Dwemer ruins from Vvardenfell to Skyrim preserve their work and show how wide their reach really was. They were not confined to one homeland, and their legacy was not limited to a single region. Their machines remained active after their cities were abandoned, which is one of the clearest signs that they expected their creations to outlast them. The historical record also places them in the major conflicts of the First era, including the events around the Battle of Red Mountain. By that point, they were not an obscure people working in isolation. They were a major power with the resources, institutions, and military strength to shape the world around them. So when people ask what happened to the Dwemer, the first answer is not the disappearance itself. The first answer is that they were a real, powerful, highly organized people whose worldview set them apart from almost everyone else in Tamriel. They favored mechanism over ritual, reason over faith, and control over compromise. That distance from the rest of the world is part of why their end still feels so unnatural. A culture that complete did not simply fade, It was removed in a way history still struggles to explain. Once the Dwemer are established as a real civilization rather than a rumor, the next question is what drove them to the edge of history. Their disappearance did not happen in isolation. It grew out of a long conflict with the Khymer, shaped by land, religion, and Dwemer ambition. The two peoples shared parts of Morrowind, but they saw the world in fundamentally different ways. The Khymer were tied to changing religious traditions and eventually to the rise of the tribunal. The Dwemer rejected that kind of faith and placed their trust in reason, engineering, and control. That difference created constant friction. Over time, it became mistrust, and at points, open war. Red Mountain turned that tension into something far more dangerous. Under its slopes, the Dwemer were pursuing work that went beyond ordinary craft. Kagrenac, their chief tonal architect, was developing methods meant to manipulate the Heart of Lorkhan, a divine source of power. To the Khymer, that was not just risky, it was blasphemous. That is why the Battle of Red Mountain was not simply another clash over territory. By then, the Dwemer were defending more than a border. They were protecting a project that had become a threat to everyone around them. Their enemies feared what they were trying to do, and even their own position had become unstable because of it. Politics, religion, and technology had all collided in one place. The Dwemer also tend to be remembered as distant and sealed off, a people hidden away in their ruins. But under Red Mountain, they were fully part of history. They were making choices that affected the whole region. The same civilization that built underground cities and precise machines was also reaching for something with the power to change reality. That gamble is central to understanding their end. When the battle reached its peak, Kagrenac's work on the tools tied to the heart became the center of the crisis. From that point on, the conflict was no longer only military, it became existential. The issue was no longer which people controlled the mountain. It was what would happen if the Dwemer succeeded in directing godlike power. That is the key to the mystery. The Dwemer were not collapsing from weakness. They were at the height of their confidence, committed to a plan that promised control over forces no mortal should have tried to command. Red Mountain brought that philosophy to its breaking point. It was where Dwemer ambition stopped being abstract and became the setup for a catastrophe. When the battle ended, the Dwemer were gone, leaving behind their cities, their machines, and a silence that has never been fully explained. Kagrenac's tools are where Dwemer ambition stops looking impressive and starts looking reckless. The Dwemer were never drawn to magic in the same way as the Khymer or the early tribunal. They trusted systems, mechanisms, and repeatable methods. If something could be measured, built, and refined, they believed it could be controlled. That outlook shaped their cities, their automatons, and the way they approached the Heart of Lorkhan. The tools most often linked to Kagrenac are Keening, Sunder, and Wraithguard. They were not ordinary weapons. In Dwemer hands, they were instruments meant to interact with the deepest structure of reality through sound, resonance, and precise application. That fits with tonal architecture, the Dwemer discipline that treated the world as something that could be tuned. It also shows how they thought about power. They did not treat the divine as untouchable. They treated it as a system they might learn to operate. That system was aimed at the Heart of Lorkhan. To the Dwemer, it was not just a sacred relic. It was a source of raw force, something that could be harnessed for a much larger design. The project most closely tied to that goal is Numidium, the massive brass construct the Dwemer were building as a statement of their philosophy. Details vary between sources, but the central idea remains the same. A giant artificial being meant to embody Dwemer mastery on a scale no other mortal culture had reached. That would have been extraordinary on its own. The danger came from what Kagrenac seems to have intended that machine to do. Numidium was not just a machine, it was bound up with a mortal attempt to seize the authority of gods. The Dwemer were not content to observe divine power. They wanted to use it, contain it, and make it obey. Kagrenac's work is the clearest example of both the strength of Dwemer thinking and its fatal flaw. The Heart of Lorkhan was never a simple resource to extract. In Elder Scrolls lore, anything tied to it tends to carry consequences larger than the act of touching it. The Dwemer appear to have believed their tools could manage those risks. Wraithguard is especially important because it is usually described as a safeguard, meant to protect the user from the destructive effects of handling the other tools and the heart itself. That detail matters because it suggests Kagrenac understood the danger. The Dwemer were not stumbling into disaster. They were preparing for it. Keening and Sunder were the active part of that preparation. One is associated with precision, the other with force, and together they reflect the Dwemer habit of breaking a problem into parts that could be managed separately. That made sense in a culture built around engineered systems. But with the heart, that level of control may have been an illusion. The tools were meant to be used in sequence as part of a ritual act rather than simple combat. They were designed for a moment when the Dwemer planned to impose their will on a divine source and force a result from it. That is what makes the whole project so unsettling. The Dwemer had the skill to build vast machines, the organization to attempt a civilization-scale project, and the confidence to believe they could finish it. But every step brought them closer to a boundary mortal beings may not have been meant to cross. The tools were deliberate instruments for a deliberate purpose, and that purpose was to bring divine force under Dwemer control. By the time the events around Red Mountain reached their end, the disappearance was no longer just a possibility. It was the likely result of a civilization trying to force a god-sized answer out of reality. Kagrenac's tools mark the point where Dwemer invention became disaster. They were the bridge between mastery and erasure. Once they were brought to bear, the next moment could not have been ordinary. When the Battle of Red Mountain reached its end, the Dwemer mystery changed from a question of intent into one of consequence. They had already tied themselves to Kagrenac's tools and the Heart of Lorkhan, but the exact moment those tools were used is where the records become unnerving. In the accounts that survive, the Dwemer do not scatter or fall in any ordinary way. They simply vanish. That matters because Red Mountain was not the only place they existed. The Dwemer were spread across Tamriel in cities, strongholds, workshops, and underground holds. If the event at the mountain had only destroyed the army there, the people elsewhere should have remained. Instead, the disappearance appears to have taken them all at once. The irony is that they left behind exactly what a civilization built on endurance would produce: ruins, machines, sealed chambers, and automatons still following old commands long after their makers were gone. The infrastructure stayed. The people did not. The broad outline of the event is consistent across later traditions. During the battle, Kagrenac's work was brought to bear on the heart, and after that the Dwemer were no longer present in the world in any normal sense. That is why the disappearance has generated so much debate. If an entire people vanished across every known Dwemer site at the same time, the cause almost has to be connected to the ritual itself. It does not look like a simple military defeat. It looks like an experiment that reached its final stage and produced something catastrophic. The problem is that the surviving witnesses do not give a clean explanation. Some accounts make it sound like the Dwemer were erased. Others leave room for the idea that they were changed into something else or taken into a state mortal observers could not recognize. Even the testimonies tied directly to Red Mountain are hard to read with confidence. They are shaped by shock, belief, and later interpretation, which makes it difficult to separate direct observation from later assumptions. Still, the aftermath is clear enough. The battle did not end with a normal victory or a retreat. The Dwemer Empire was there, committed to a dangerous act, and then it was gone. What remained was not a civilization in decline, but a civilization with no living continuity. Its cities became ruins, its constructs kept moving, its name survived only as a question. The scale of that loss makes simple explanations hard to hold on to. The Dwemer were not confined to one homeland that could be wiped out in a single strike. By the time of the battle, they had built a wide network of settlements and outposts, and their influence reached across the continent. That means Red Mountain was not just the collapse of one battlefield, it was the end of an entire people's active presence. Any theory that treats the disappearance as nothing more than casualties runs into that problem immediately. The scholars in their cities, the workers maintaining their machines, the guards in distant strongholds, and the Dwemer deep underground all disappear from the record together. Their ruins also make the mystery sharper. Dwemer sites do not feel abandoned in the ordinary sense. They still show structure and purpose. Doors remain sealed, defenses still work. Factory systems, pressure devices, and clockwork constructs continue long after their makers are gone. In some places, the old mechanisms seem to have been built with no expectation that their creators would ever return. That gives the disappearance a colder shape. It suggests planning, but not survival. It suggests a people who knew how to build for permanence and still failed to remain inside their own legacy. The sources closest to the event keep pointing to the same trigger. Kagrenac's tools used on the heart. That is the hinge of the entire mystery. Whatever the Dwemer hoped to achieve, the result was not partial. It did not affect only a handful of researchers. It reached every Dwemer we know of, which is why later scholars keep returning to the same conclusion. If the disappearance was tied to an act of power, then the act was enormous enough to alter the whole race at once. If it was a mistake, it was one on a scale Tamriel has rarely seen. That is why Red Mountain sits at the center of the Dwemer mystery. It is the moment where the war, the tools, the heart, and the disappearance all meet. Whatever happened to them, it happened there, fast enough to leave no clear escape, and strange enough to make every later explanation feel incomplete. After that moment, Tamriel was left with the evidence it still has now: machines without makers, halls without people, and a vanished empire whose final step still does not make sense. Once you move past the shock, the basic problem is simple. The Dwemer left no trustworthy account of their own end. What survives comes from outsiders, later historians, and scraps, written by people who already treated the disappearance as a miracle, a curse, or a disaster. So every theory has to work from a narrow chain of facts. The Dwemer were present. They were involved with the Heart of Lorkhan. Then they were gone. Any explanation that cannot match that sequence does not hold up. The oldest answer is that they were destroyed as punishment. In that reading, they went too far, crossed a boundary, and were struck down by a power beyond their control. It fits the religious language that grew around the event, especially in Khymer and later Dwemer tradition, where Red Mountain became a sign of judgment. It also fits the scale of the loss. When an entire people vanishes, punishment is the first explanation many cultures reach for. The weakness is that the aftermath does not resemble ordinary destruction. There are no bodies in the expected sense, and the Dwemer machines do not simply fail all at once. The scene looks less like a city that was burned and more like a civilization removed from the world. That is why the tonal theory has remained so important. The Dwemer were known for trying to shape reality through mathematics, sound, and engineering. Their devices were not just weapons, they were attempts to alter the rules underneath the world. Kagrenac's work suggests they believed reality could be adjusted like a mechanism. On that reading, the disaster at Red Mountain was not divine fire falling on a city. It was a failed attempt to apply Dwemer methods to a power source they did not truly understand. If the heart was the core and the tonal tools were the method, then the result may have been less killed than removed from the pattern that held them together. That connects directly to Numidium, the brass god the Dwemer were building. Even the surviving accounts make clear why it matters. It shows what they wanted from the heart. They were not simply studying a sacred relic. They were trying to turn divine power into something usable, depending on the source. Kagrenac's tools were meant to activate the project, stabilize it, or let the Dwemer endure contact with it. Whatever the exact purpose, the direction is clear. They were not testing on the edge of danger. They were trying to force an answer out of a god-level problem. That makes the disappearance look less like a random accident and more like the cost of a failed experiment. There is also a broader possibility that the Dwemer were not destroyed so much as transformed or failed in an attempt at apotheosis. In that version, they tried to become something beyond mortal form, and the result was not death but removal from normal existence. That helps explain why the aftermath feels incomplete. It does not require a battlefield full of corpses. It only requires that the Dwemer broke their old state without successfully reaching a new one. The weakness is that this remains interpretive. It helps describe the shape of the mystery, but not exactly what they became. The limits of the evidence matter here. Some later stories suggest Kagrenac made a mistake in procedure. Others imply the Dwemer understood the risk and accepted it anyway. There are even texts that hint they had already discussed the possibility of losing their bodies, which would make the disappearance less like an accident and more like a catastrophic side effect of a planned transcendence. But none of those sources can be treated as a clean record. They were written after the fact, filtered through politics, theology, and the need to explain a people whose absence had already become legendary. Even the surviving ruins cannot tell the whole story by themselves. A machine can keep working long after its makers are gone. That does not mean it can explain why they vanished. What makes these theories persuasive is that each one explains part of the evidence, and none explains all of it. Punishment fits the religious aftermath. Tonal erasure fits the Dwemer's own methods. Failed apotheosis fits the scale of their ambition. Transformation fits the absence of a normal death. The surviving texts never settle the matter because the event itself was probably too extreme to leave a clean historical record. Later writers were left to rebuild it from ruins, theology, and fragments. Even the absence of certainty becomes evidence of how complete the event was. If the Dwemer had simply been killed in one place, the record would be easier to reconstruct. Instead, the world inherited a blank space where an entire people used to be. That uncertainty became part of Elder Scrolls history. The Dwemer did not fade into a footnote. Their absence shaped how later cultures understood the limits of power. Their ruins became places of study, Their devices became relics of lost mastery, and their fate became a warning against treating the divine as something that can be engineered. It also changed how other races approached Dwemer technology. After the disappearance, their cities were stripped, sealed, explored, and fought over because everyone knew their knowledge had outlived them, even if their civilization had not. Scholars kept returning to the same question: if the Dwemer could build this much, what exactly did they touch that made them vanish? That is the real fallout of Red Mountain. The Dwemer left behind proof that intelligence, technology, and ambition can still end in total erasure. And because no single explanation closes the case, the mystery survives right alongside their machines. The simplest answer is that the Dwemer did not die in any normal way. During Kagrenac's experiment at Red Mountain, the entire race vanished at once, leaving behind their cities, machines, and almost nothing else. It looks less like a battle than a catastrophic failure of their own design. Some sources treat it as punishment, others as a failed attempt at transcendence, and others as erasure through tonal magic. What we never get is a final, confirmed version. That uncertainty is the ending. The Dwemer remain through what they built, but absent in every other sense. Their ruins still stand, their people do not. That broken contrast is why the mystery still matters.